Well, I would say first, it shouldn't come as any surprise that we're in regular touch with social media platforms. Well, first, we are in regular touch with these social media platforms, and those engagements typically happen through members of our senior staff, but also members of our COVID-19 team. So we are regularly making sure social media platforms are aware of the latest narratives dangerous to public health. That is an example of the kind of information that we are flagging or raising. We've increased disinformation research and tracking within the Surgeon General's office. We're flagging problematic posts for Facebook that spread disinformation. That is an example of the kind of information that we are flagging or raising. We're flagging problematic posts for Facebook.
So those clips of Jen Psaki were back in the 2020-2021 timeframe, talking about how they are in regular touch with social media companies, telling them what should be pulled down from their platforms and what should be left up. If you think that sounds like a violation of the First Amendment, then you might be a domestic terrorist, and you should probably go talk to somebody about that, get that checked out. After it became very clear that the Biden administration was engaging in this online censorship, there were lawsuits with one court ruling that it was a clear violation of the First Amendment for the government to be doing this.
Federal judge in Louisiana is limiting the Biden administration from contacting social media companies. The judge saying the administration likely violated the First Amendment when it pressured those companies to remove certain posts.
Which then led to, a few months back, the Biden administration claimed they were freezing communications with social media companies while the pending case in the Supreme Court on the topic was going on. But according to Mark Warner, a senator from Virginia who chairs the Senate Intelligence Committee, federal agencies have started doing the type of censorship that they were doing before. The issue here, and what really makes it a blatant First Amendment violation, is that you have to consider what is disinformation, what is misinformation, and who are determining these things. For most politicians and federal officials, it's just going to be whatever they don't like or something that goes against the establishment narrative in DC. But we've seen the definition of what is misinformation, what is disinformation, continue to sort of move further and further over towards just regular protected First Amendment speech. To sum this up, the government censored speech on social media platforms, then they were sued for censoring speech on social media platforms. And they said, okay, we'll stop doing it while these court cases are still pending. Now they're saying, okay, we're going to continue to do this. We don't really care what you think. Just remember, it's for your safety. When all of this was being litigated in the lower courts, this is how MSNBC was defending the government, followed by journalist Matt Taibbi testifying with direct information that contradicts this propagandist on MSNBC.
Essentially, what a lot of these allegations have to do with is the government flagging posts that violate the standards that these social media companies have independently set up. So if they find something that, they're flagging this post and say, hey, they're not explicitly saying you need to take this down. Often there's sort of an implicit implication there, if saying, bringing this to your attention, and then the social media company can decide independently whether or not that violates their ongoing standards.
Sure, buddy.
But it's a really new area and a really complicated one, and one that there should be close guardrails on to make sure that the government is not overreaching. But the idea that the government can't have any communication with these social media companies, I don't think is really a world that we would want to live in. And the FBI side, it's something I followed really closely, and there's just not a lot of evidence that the FBI was encouraging social media companies to take down posts.
What degree can the White House, even if that agenda is for ostensibly public health, to what degree can they engage in a pressure campaign on Facebook, Twitter, other social media companies to advance their message, even if their message is backed up by medicine and science? And then afterwards, perhaps more importantly, what kinds of consequences can they imply or otherwise suggest might happen to those who don't listen?
So I think this is a little bit of a corrective, but I clearly feel that in the end, the decision will be refined somewhat because government has to have the right to have its own free speech, to push back when they see things on social media they think are dangerous.
Yeah, and the government would argue we were just colluding, if you want to put it that way, to stop bad information, to getting in the hands of people and threatening their well-being.
You keep wondering, when is America going, and when are Americans going to say, what is wrong with these people? What has happened to this country in the sense of what the Republicans have done to this country? You can take the MAGA judges. You can take the judge down in Louisiana who recently just basically voided the First Amendment of this country. Perhaps voided it.
It's inaccurate, dishonest, and, in a word, dong water.
It is an extraordinarily broad, even radical ruling in many ways. made by one trial judge before a trial and before there was even discovery in the case, listening to two very conservative Republican attorneys general basically putting into the law the conspiracy theory idea that somehow the government's been censoring social media and keeping conservative voices off. This is a potentially very significant threat to the ability to stop election interference.
My name is Matt Taibbi. I've been a reporter for 30 years and a staunch advocate of the First Amendment. I'm here today because of a series of events that began late last year when I received a note from a source online. It read, "Are you interested in doing a deep dive into what censorship and manipulation was going on at Twitter?" A week later, the first of what became known as the Twitter Files reports came out. What we found in the files was a sweeping effort to reverse that promise and use machine learning and other tools to turn the internet into an instrument of censorship and social control. Unfortunately, our own government appears to be playing a lead role. We saw the first hints in communications between Twitter executives before the 2020 election, when we read things like "flagged by DHS" or "please see attached report from FBI for potential misinformation." This would be attached to an Excel spreadsheet with a long list of names whose accounts were often suspended shortly after. We learned Twitter, Facebook, Google, and other companies developed a formal system for taking in moderation requests from every corner of government, from the FBI, the DHS, the HHS, DOD, the Global Engagement Center at State, even the CIA. For every government agency scanning Twitter, there were perhaps 20 quasi-private entities doing the same thing, including Stanford's Election Integrity Partnership, NewsGuard, the Global Disinformation Index, and many others, many taxpayer-funded. A focus of this fast-growing network, as Mike noted, is making lists of people whose opinions, beliefs, associations, or sympathies are deemed misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation. That last term is just a euphemism for true but inconvenient.
Lastly, we're going to take a look at one of the organizations that's tasked with this so-called disinformation. This is Hamilton 68, a dashboard that is a part of the Global Disinformation Index is what they call it. Essentially, they claim there are X number of Russian bots and Russian disinformation accounts online that are influencing our elections, according to them. But when you dive further into it, you really see that it's just a censorship index, and it's looking to censor speech that goes against the narratives they're trying to frame.
Last year, the U.S. intelligence community concluded that in 2016, Russia launched a campaign of disinformation to discredit Hillary Clinton and help elect Donald Trump. One of the sharpest analysts of Russia's so-called active measures is former U.S. government intelligence analyst Clint Watts. You think that it was successful, and in fact, you specifically write that Russia helped give Trump Michigan and Wisconsin, and therefore the presidency. What's your proof of that?
Just from my analysis of watching it and looking at the votes. Essentially, those were the two closest contests in the United States. And the part about social bots that's important is it allows you to amplify your message to such an extent that you can change the way the media environment operates, and you cause mainstream media to actually react to the story. So the first part was awareness, and our dashboard, what we tried to show is there's two parts to influence. The first thing you do is you infiltrate the audience, and you do that by mimicking them. Then once you have that audience paying attention to you, that's when you start to influence. And that's really what we watched over a couple-year period.
Now, you and your team, you guys created a website here, right? Walk me through this, because these aren't the kind of websites I like to hang out on. So this is Hamilton 68.
Yeah, so for years, my colleagues and I, we tracked Russian accounts or Russian-motivated accounts over time.
So this is actually a live feed of information, Russian bots and Russian propaganda, a word that you would use. Literally right now there are Russian bots, according to your website, that are putting this out into the world. Is that correct?
What is Hamilton 68 and what has it done?
So I wrote about it when it was formed not even a year ago, last summer, because it was yet another example, probably the most vivid one yet, of this kind of union between Democrats on the one hand and neocons on the other. They said that their purpose of their group was to combat disinformation and the attack on the American democracy by Russia and other groups. And their main kind of feature was that they would have this dashboard called Hamilton 68 that purported to track the activity of Russian influencers on Twitter by tracking 600 accounts. Nobody knows which accounts they've designated as influence of Russia. They're not necessarily Russian. They're just people who, in the eyes of Bill Kristol and his friends, are people who espouse Russia or pro-Russia themes, and they just constantly make claims about what Russia is doing on Twitter that the U.S. media, in the most shocking way, uncritically ingest and puts into their headlines as fact about what Russia is doing.
Now, this data comes from Hamilton 68. That's a web dashboard that any of our viewers can look at, and it tracks around 600 Russia-linked accounts. And it doesn't provide the names of those accounts, because if it did, the Russians could simply change them.